In a brownstone in Brooklyn, a 7-year-old boy hasn't looked anyone in the eye for 3 years. 7 specialists have come and gone, each with credentials and theories but no connection. Then Rosa arrives, carrying nothing but a worn apron and calloused hands that know how to wait. When the boy builds a fortress from couch cushions, she doesn't tear it down. She sits outside it and begins to hum songs her grandmother taught her in Oaxaca. No English words, just melodies that ask for nothing. The first time he peeks through the gap, something shifts. But the parents don't see miracles, they see a cleaning woman overstepping. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Judgment builds like storm clouds. Can patience survive suspicion? Stay with us to see how a house divided learns to listen, and a child finds his voice in the space between 2 languages. The August heat pressed against the windows of the Hartley brownstone like an unwelcome guest. Inside, the air conditioning hummed at a frequency that made the crystal chandelier in the foyer tremble slightly, casting fractured light across hardwood floors that gleamed from years of professional care. Everything in this house had been maintained, polished, preserved. Everything except the boy. Daniel Hartley sat in the corner of the living room behind a fortress he had constructed from sofa cushions, throw pillows, and a dining room chair he had dragged across the floor at dawn. The scraping sound had woken his father, James, who now sat in his home office 3 rooms away, pressing his palms against his temples and pretending to read emails he had already answered twice. The sound of his son moving furniture at 5 in the morning had become so routine that James no longer startled. He simply woke, waited for the scraping to stop, and then tried to return to a sleep that never came. Daniel's mother, Vanessa, stood in the kitchen holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. She stared at the refrigerator, specifically at the collection of business cards held by magnets shaped like fruit. Dr. Patricia Brennan, developmental pediatrician. Dr. Michael Torres, child psychiatrist. Dr. Alison Webb, behavioral specialist. Dr. Stephen Park, neurologist. Dr. Jennifer Liu, occupational therapist. Dr. Raymond Foster, speech pathologist. Dr. Marcus Sullivan, applied behavioral analysis expert. 7 names. 7 disappointed faces. 7 variations of the same conclusion delivered with varying degrees of sympathy. Your son is autistic. He requires intensive intervention. Here are our recommendations. Here is our fee schedule. Here is the reality you must accept. Vanessa had accepted it. She had accepted it so thoroughly that acceptance had become its own kind of prison. She had read every book, joined every online support group, attended every workshop. She had learned the terminology, memorized the acronyms, could speak fluently about sensory integration dysfunction and proprioceptive input. She had become an expert in her son's condition. What she had not become was an expert in her son. The doorbell rang precisely at 8 o'clock. Vanessa set down her cold coffee and walked through the hallway, past the living room where Daniel's fortress stood silent and impenetrable, past the framed family photographs that documented a life before diagnosis when smiles came easily and eye contact was assumed. She opened the door to find a woman in her late 50s standing on the stoop, a canvas bag slung over one shoulder, wearing a simple blue dress and white sneakers that had been scrubbed clean but could not hide their age. Rosa Mendez had a face that told stories without speaking. Deep lines framed her mouth, not from frowning but from years of smiling at children in parks, at elderly women in grocery stores, at strangers who needed to be seen. Her hands, clasped in front of her, were the hands of someone who had worked since childhood, strong and scarred and capable. Her eyes, dark and steady, met Vanessa's without presumption or apology. The agency said you need someone 3 days a week, Rosa said. Her accent shaped the words carefully, each syllable given its due weight. I can do that. I can do more if you need. Vanessa felt something tighten in her chest. She had requested a housekeeper through the agency after the last nanny had quit, after the behavioral therapist had suggested they needed to reduce variables in Daniel's environment, after she had realized that maintaining the appearance of a functional household required help she could no longer pretend she didn't need. She had expected someone younger, someone who spoke English as a first language, someone who fit the aesthetic of the neighborhood. She had not expected this woman who looked at her with patience that felt almost invasive. "Come in," Vanessa said, stepping aside. "I'll show you around." Rosa entered, and the house seemed to adjust around her presence. She moved through the foyer without touching anything, her gaze taking in the chandelier, the polished floors, the photographs, the closed door behind which James sat pretending to work. She followed Vanessa into the kitchen, nodding as Vanessa explained where things were kept, which cleaning products to use, which rooms required daily attention and which could wait. Rosa listened without interrupting, occasionally touching a countertop or cabinet door as if learning the house through texture rather than instruction. And upstairs, Vanessa continued, leading Rosa toward the staircase. "There are 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. My son's room is at the end of the hall. He doesn't like people in his space, so please don't go in there unless I specifically ask. Actually, it's better if you just avoid that hallway entirely." Rosa stopped at the base of the stairs. "Your son," she said. "How old?" 7. Vanessa's voice flattened. "He has autism. Severe, according to most of the specialists. He doesn't speak. He doesn't like to be touched. He doesn't make eye contact. The previous nanny couldn't handle it. That's why I'm hiring someone just for housework. It's easier." Rosa nodded slowly, her expression unchanged. "What does he like?" Vanessa blinked. "What? What does he like?" Rosa repeated. "What makes him happy?" The question landed like something foreign. Vanessa opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "He likes patterns," she said finally. "Lining things up. He has these wooden blocks he arranges by color. He watches the same 3 videos on repeat. He hums sometimes, but not songs, just sounds." "Does he like music?" Rosa asked. "I don't know," Vanessa admitted, and the admission felt like failure. "We've tried music therapy." He didn't respond. Rosa's expression softened, though not with pity. With something closer to recognition. "Sometimes response is quiet," she said. "Sometimes it comes later. Sometimes it looks different than we expect." Vanessa didn't know how to reply to that. She turned and continued up the stairs, pointing out the bathrooms, the linen closet, the master bedroom with its perfectly made bed and curtains that blocked out the morning sun. Rosa followed, still touching things lightly, still nodding, still absorbing the geography of this family's careful distance. When they returned downstairs, James emerged from his office. He was tall, thin, wearing reading glasses that he removed immediately upon seeing a stranger in his home. His tie was loosened, his shirt wrinkled in a way that suggested he had slept in it or hadn't slept at all. "This is Rosa," Vanessa said. "She'll be starting today. 3 days a week." James extended his hand automatically. Rosa shook it, her grip firm and brief. "James Hartley," he said. "Thank you for coming. We appreciate your help." His tone was polite, transactional, already dismissing her as he had dismissed every other service provider who had cycled through their lives. Rosa held his gaze a moment longer than necessary, then nodded. "I will take good care," she said simply. James retreated back into his office. Vanessa exhaled slowly. "He's under a lot of stress," she explained, though Rosa hadn't asked. "We both are. This isn't what we expected our life to look like." Rosa set her canvas bag on the kitchen counter and began removing its contents. A pair of rubber gloves, a small bottle of vinegar, a worn dish towel embroidered with yellow flowers. "Life looks like many things," she said quietly. "Sometimes we must learn new ways to see it." Vanessa watched her for a moment, unsure whether to be offended or comforted. Before she could decide, a sound came from the living room. Not loud, not distressed, just a low humming that vibrated through the walls. Daniel's voice, wordless and rhythmic, repeating the same 3 notes over and over. "That's him," Vanessa said unnecessarily. "He does that. It doesn't mean anything." Rosa tilted her head, listening. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It means something to him, she said. That is enough. She rolled up her sleeves and began to work. Vanessa stood there for another moment, then turned and climbed the stairs to her bedroom, closing the door behind her with the soft click of someone who has been closing doors for a very long time. Rosa moved through the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had cleaned 1,000 kitchens before this one. She wiped counters, reorganized cabinets that were already organized, swept floors that were already clean. But her attention was not on the work. Her attention was on the humming that came from the other room, steady and insistent, a heartbeat in sound. After an hour, she walked to the doorway of the living room and stopped. The fortress was still there, cushions stacked in a configuration that suggested both randomness and intention. She could see the top of Daniel's head, dark hair uncombed, and one small hand visible at the edge of a pillow, fingers tapping against the hardwood in time with his humming. Rosa did not approach. She did not call out. She simply stood in the doorway and began to hum along, matching his 3 notes exactly. Her voice was low, rough from years and cigarettes she had quit a decade ago, but it carried. She hummed for 30 seconds, then stopped and returned to the kitchen. She repeated this pattern throughout the morning. Work for a while. Walk to the doorway. Hum the same 3 notes. Leave. Each time, she stayed a few seconds longer. Each time, she added a 4th note, then a 5th, building a melody around the foundation he had established. She never looked directly at the fortress. She never tried to see him. She simply offered sound, a call without demand for an answer. By noon, the humming from inside the fortress had changed. It was no longer just 3 notes. It was 4. Then 5. He was following her, learning her additions, making them his own. Vanessa came downstairs and stopped in the hallway, listening. She heard Rosa in the kitchen, heard the running water, heard the soft humming. And then she heard something else. Her son's voice, still wordless, still repetitive, but different. Bigger. Fuller. Reaching beyond the walls of his fortress towards something outside himself. She walked to the kitchen. Rosa was washing dishes that were already clean, her back to the doorway. "What are you doing?" Vanessa asked, and her voice came out sharper than she intended. Rosa turned, hands still wet, suds clinging to her fingers. "I am washing dishes," she said. "No." Vanessa stepped closer. "I heard you. You were humming." "With him?" "Yes," Rosa said. "He started a song. I am helping him finish it. He doesn't sing songs." Vanessa's voice trembled. "He hums. It's self-stimulatory behavior. It doesn't mean anything." Rosa dried her hands on the embroidered towel, taking her time. "With respect," she said, "I think it means he is trying to tell us something. We are just not listening in the right language." "You're a housekeeper," Vanessa said, and immediately regretted the cruelty in her tone. "You're not a therapist. You're not trained in this. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but please, just clean. That's what I hired you for." Rosa nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "I will clean. But I will also listen. Listening does not require a degree." Vanessa wanted to argue, wanted to pull out the stack of evaluations and treatment plans that proved she knew more about autism than this woman ever could. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the steadiness in Rosa's gaze. Maybe it was the fact that for the first time in 3 years, her son's humming sounded like communication rather than withdrawal. She turned and left the kitchen without another word, climbing the stairs to her bedroom once more, closing the door once more, and sitting on the edge of the bed with her hands pressed over her face. Downstairs, Rosa returned to the dishes. And from the living room, Daniel's voice continued, building melodies from the foundation of 3 notes, constructing something that might, to someone who listened carefully, sound like hope. The afternoon unfolded in a rhythm Rosa established without announcing. She cleaned the downstairs bathroom, wiped mirrors until they gleamed, scrubbed grout that had been neglected for months. Every 20 minutes, she returned to the doorway of the living room and hummed. Sometimes Daniel hummed back. Sometimes he didn't. Rosa never seemed disappointed either way. She simply offered, then withdrew, a pattern as reliable as breathing. At 2 o'clock, James emerged from his office looking haggard. He barely glanced at Rosa as he moved through the kitchen, opening the refrigerator and staring at its contents without seeing them. Rosa was wiping down the stove, her movements slow and deliberate. "You've been here since 8, James said without turning around. "You should take a break." "I am fine," Rosa replied. "I do not tire easily." "Still." James closed the refrigerator without taking anything. "We're not running a sweatshop here. Take 15 minutes. Sit down." Rosa set down her cloth and nodded. "Thank you." She poured herself a glass of water from the tap and sat at the small kitchen table, the one Vanessa had bought for breakfast nooks but never used because Daniel couldn't tolerate eating in rooms with too many windows. James leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "My wife mentioned you were humming with our son." "Yes," Rosa said. "He doesn't understand that kind of interaction." James's voice was tired, not unkind. "He's not trying to communicate with you. It's just something he does to self-soothe." "Perhaps," Rosa said, sipping her water. "Or perhaps he is trying to show us how he understands the world. Sometimes we decide what people mean before we ask them." James laughed, a short bitter sound. "You can't ask him. He doesn't talk." "There are many ways to talk," Rosa said. She set down her glass. "My grandmother, she could not read or write. But she could tell you what the weather would do 3 days ahead by watching birds. She could tell you if a child was sick before the fever came. People said she was simple. But she was not simple. She was speaking a language they did not learn." James studied her for a long moment. "You're not from here," he said. "Where are you from originally?" "Oaxaca," Rosa said. "A small village in the mountains. I came here when I was 19. That was a long time ago." "Do you have children?" "3. Rosa's face softened. "2 sons, 1 daughter. All grown now. All with children of their own. I have 7 grandchildren. And none of them are like Daniel." James's question was clinical, detached, as if he were asking about a medical condition rather than a person. Rosa's expression didn't change. "My youngest grandson, he did not speak until he was 5. Everyone said there was something wrong. Doctors, teachers, everyone. My daughter was told to prepare for a difficult life." "What happened?" James asked despite himself. "He spoke," Rosa said simply. "One day he began, and he has not stopped since. He is 12 now. He talks so much we must remind him to listen. But before he spoke with words, he spoke in other ways. With his hands. With drawings. With the way he arranged his toys. We learned to understand him before he learned to speak our way." James felt something twist in his chest. "That's not the same," he said. "Daniel is severely autistic. The specialists have all said the same thing. He's not going to just start talking one day. This isn't something you wait out." "No," Rosa agreed. "You do not wait. You walk beside. You listen. You make space for him to become who he is, not who you need him to be." The words landed with unexpected weight. James looked away, jaw tight. "You don't know what it's like," he said quietly. "You don't know what it's like to watch your child disappear. To watch him slip further and further away until you can't reach him anymore. Every specialist we've hired has told us what he can't do, what he'll never do, how we need to adjust our expectations. Do you know what that does to a parent? To be told repeatedly that your child is broken and nothing you do will fix it." Rosa stood, picked up her glass, and walked to the sink. She rinsed it slowly, her back to James. "He is not broken," she said. "He is different. But different is not the same as broken. And maybe the problem is not that you cannot reach him. Maybe the problem is you are reaching in the wrong direction. James opened his mouth to respond, to defend himself, to explain all the ways this woman didn't understand the complexity of their situation. But before he could speak, a sound came from the living room. Not humming this time. Something else. A rustling. Movement. Both James and Rosa turned toward the doorway. And then, slowly, a small figure emerged from behind the fortress. Daniel stood at the edge of the living room, his hair sticking up at odd angles, his t-shirt twisted around his torso. He did not look at them. His gaze remained fixed on the floor. But he was out. For the first time in weeks, he had left his fortress voluntarily in the middle of the day. Rosa did not move. James took a half step forward, then stopped, afraid that any sudden motion would send his son retreating. Daniel stood there for several seconds, swaying slightly, his hands flapping at his sides in the way that specialists called stimming and James called heartbreaking. Then Daniel began to hum. The same melody Rosa had been building with him all morning. 5 notes, rising and falling, a pattern that sounded almost like a question. Rosa, without looking at the boy directly, began to hum back. She added 2 more notes, completing the phrase, turning the question into an answer. Daniel's hands stopped flapping. He tilted his head, still not looking up, but listening. Listening so intently that the whole house seemed to hold its breath. Rosa hummed again. The same 7 notes. Then she added an 8th, extending the melody further. Daniel's mouth opened. And in a voice that James had almost forgotten existed, he added a 9th note. Not hummed this time. Sung. A single clear tone that hung in the air like something fragile and impossibly precious. James felt his knees weaken. He reached for the counter to steady himself, his vision blurring. Vanessa appeared at the top of the stairs, drawn by some instinct, and froze there, hand on the banister, watching. Rosa continued humming, her voice steady, inviting. Daniel added another note. Then another. He was not repeating anymore. He was creating. Building onto what she offered, making it his own, transforming her melody into something that belonged to both of them. The song lasted less than a minute. When it ended, Daniel turned and walked back to his fortress, disappearing behind the cushions as if nothing had happened. The house fell silent again. But it was not the same silence as before. Something had shifted. Something had opened. James looked at Rosa. She was drying her hands on her embroidered towel, her expression unchanged, as if what had just happened was ordinary. As if miracles were simply part of the day's work. How did you do that? James whispered. Rosa folded the towel and set it on the counter. I did nothing, she said. I only made space for him to do what he already wanted to do. She picked up her cleaning supplies and moved toward the dining room, ready to continue the work she had been hired to do. Behind her, James stood motionless, staring at the empty doorway where his son had briefly appeared. Upstairs, Vanessa sat down on the top step, her hands still gripping the banister, and began to cry without sound. In the living room, behind the fortress of cushions and chairs, Daniel arranged his wooden blocks in a new pattern. Not by color this time. By sound. Grouping them according to the pitch they made when tapped against the floor, building a visual representation of the melody he had helped create. He worked slowly, deliberately, humming softly to himself as he constructed something that no one else would understand but that made perfect sense in the language he spoke. Rosa wiped down the dining room table that was rarely used, polished the chairs that no one sat in, straightened the placemats that existed only for appearance. And as she worked, she hummed quietly, adding new notes to the melody, offering them like gifts to the boy behind the cushions, trusting that he would take what he needed and leave the rest. Outside, August pressed on, heavy and relentless. But inside the Hartley brownstone, something had changed. Not fixed. Not solved. But changed. A door that had been closed for 3 years had opened, just slightly. Just enough to let in the smallest sliver of light. And in that light, a boy who had been told he would never speak was learning that speaking came in many forms, and that sometimes the most important conversations happen without words at all. The first week passed in patterns. Rosa arrived at 8 each morning, moving through the house with quiet competence, and every 20 minutes she would return to that doorway and hum. Sometimes Daniel responded. Sometimes he didn't. James began to anticipate these moments, finding excuses to be in the kitchen or hallway when Rosa's humming drifted through the house. Vanessa watched from upstairs, standing at the top of the staircase with her arms crossed, unwilling to hope but unable to look away. On the 4th day, Rosa brought something new. A small wooden percussion instrument called a gyro, carved from a gourd and etched with ridges. She set it on the kitchen table without explanation, and when she passed the living room doorway, instead of humming, she scraped a wooden stick across its surface. The sound was rhythmic, textured, nothing like the smooth tones they had been building. From inside the fortress came immediate silence. Then, after 30 seconds, a tentative tapping. Daniel was drumming his fingers against the floor in response, trying to match the rhythm. Rosa played the gyro again, slower this time, emphasizing each beat. The tapping behind the cushions adjusted, syncing with her pattern. She added variations, slight changes in tempo and emphasis. Daniel followed, his fingers moving faster, more confident, translating her rhythms into his own language of percussion. Vanessa descended the stairs so quietly that Rosa didn't hear her approach. She stood in the hallway, watching this woman with calloused hands create music from a vegetable instrument, watching her son respond to something that 7 specialists had never thought to try. "Where did you get that?" Vanessa asked, her voice carefully neutral. Rosa looked up. "My uncle made it," she said. "In Oaxaca. I brought it when I came here many years ago. I keep it to remember." "Why are you using it with Daniel?" Rosa ran her thumb along the instrument's ridges. "Sometimes voices need different shapes," she said. "Sometimes words are not the only language. Music crosses borders that speech cannot." "He's autistic," Vanessa said. "Not deaf. He can hear fine." "Yes," Rosa agreed. "But hearing is not the same as understanding. And sometimes understanding is not about the ears at all. It is about finding the right frequency." Vanessa wanted to argue, wanted to recite the literature she had memorized about sensory processing and auditory integration therapy. But she couldn't. Because in the living room, her son was drumming with increasing complexity, creating polyrhythms that shouldn't have been possible for a 7-year-old who supposedly lived in his own isolated world. That evening, after Rosa had left for the day, James emerged from his office to find Vanessa sitting at the kitchen table, the gyro in her hands. She was turning it over, examining the carved patterns, running her fingers along its ridges. "She's different," James said, pouring himself a drink he probably didn't need. "The other people we've hired, the nannies and therapists, they all came with methods and strategies and clinical approaches. She just shows up and plays music." Vanessa set down the instrument. "I know," she said. "And I hate that it's working." James sat across from her. "Why do you hate it?" "Because we've tried everything," Vanessa said, and her voice cracked slightly. "We've spent thousands of dollars. We've followed every protocol. We've done exactly what the experts told us to do. And then this housekeeper shows up with a gourd and suddenly Daniel is responding in ways he never has before. What does that say about everything we've done? What does that say about us?" James reached across the table and took her hand. "Maybe it says we were asking the wrong questions." Vanessa pulled her hand away. "The specialist said he needs structure. Routine. Applied behavioral analysis. Evidence-based interventions. Not folk music and intuition. Maybe he needs both," James said quietly. "Maybe the specialists aren't wrong, they're just incomplete." Before Vanessa could respond, a sound interrupted them. Footsteps. Small, hesitant footsteps padding across the living room floor. They both froze. Daniel never walked around the house at night. He stayed in his fortress or his bedroom, emerging only when guided. The footsteps stopped at the kitchen doorway. James and Vanessa turned slowly, afraid to spook him. Daniel stood there in his pajamas, one hand gripping the doorframe, the other hanging at his side. He wasn't looking at them. His gaze remained fixed on the table. On the gyro. He took one step into the kitchen. Then another. His movements were stiff, almost mechanical, but purposeful. He walked directly to the table, reached out, and picked up the instrument. He held it carefully, turning it over in his hands the same way Vanessa had done, exploring its weight and texture. Then he looked up. Not at his parents. But past them, toward the kitchen counter where Rosa's embroidered dish towel still hung from the oven handle. And in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, rough from disuse and uncertainty, he spoke his first word in 3 years. Rosa. The name came out slowly, carefully shaped, each syllable given separate attention. Ro-sa. Not perfect. Not fluent. But unmistakably intentional. Unmistakably speech. Vanessa's hand flew to her mouth. James pushed back from the table so abruptly his chair scraped against the floor. Daniel flinched at the noise but didn't retreat. He held the gyro against his chest and repeated the word. Rosa. Then he turned and walked back to the living room, disappearing into his fortress with the instrument still clutched in his hands. From behind the cushions came the sound of the wooden stick scraping against the ridges, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. Creating rhythms in the darkness. Speaking in patterns only he fully understood. James and Vanessa sat in stunned silence. Neither moved. Neither spoke. The reality of what had just happened was too large to fit into words, too fragile to examine too closely. Their son, who specialists had warned might never speak again, who existed in what they had been told was an unreachable world, had walked into the kitchen of his own accord and spoken a name. Not Mama. Not Dada. But the name of a woman who had been in their lives for less than a week. Vanessa felt something inside her crack open. Not quite relief. Not quite joy. Something more complicated. Something that tasted like grief and gratitude mixed together until they were indistinguishable. We have to tell her, James said finally. Tomorrow. When she comes back. We have to tell her what happened. Vanessa nodded, still unable to speak. In the living room, the gyro continued its rhythmic scraping, a lullaby in percussion, a bridge between worlds. That night, Daniel fell asleep with the instrument beside him in his fortress, and for the first time in months, he didn't wake screaming. He slept through until morning, undisturbed by the nightmares that usually fragmented his rest. And in the morning, when Rosa arrived at 8 o'clock, she found James and Vanessa waiting for her in the kitchen with expressions that looked like people who had witnessed something they couldn't quite explain. He said your name, James told her. Last night. He came out of his room and he said your name. Rosa set down her canvas bag slowly. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply nodded, as if this information confirmed something she already knew. Good, she said. Now he knows he can speak. The rest will come in its own time. How did you know this would work? Vanessa asked. How did you know he would respond to you? Rosa began unpacking her cleaning supplies. I did not know, she said. I only believe that every person wants to be understood. Your son is no different. He has been trying to speak all along. We were simply not listening in the right way. What do we do now? James's voice carried a desperation he usually hid better. Do we push him? Do we try to get him to say more words? Do we call the speech therapist back? Rosa looked at him with those steady dark eyes that seemed to see through pretense. You do nothing, she said. You let him lead. He will tell you what he needs when he is ready. Your job is not to pull words from him. Your job is to make space for those words to arrive safely. But the specialists said, Vanessa started. The specialists do not live in this house, Rosa interrupted gently. They do not hear him at 5 in the morning building his fortress. They do not see how he arranges his blocks. They do not know the language he is already speaking. They know many things, yes. But they do not know your son the way you can know him if you learn to listen differently." The words hung in the air between them. Vanessa felt anger rise in her throat, the instinct to defend all the time and money and energy they had poured into trying to help their son. But beneath the anger was something else. A small voice asking what if she was right? What if all their efforts to fix Daniel had been preventing them from seeing who he actually was? Rosa picked up her cleaning supplies and moved toward the living room. When she reached the doorway, she paused and began to hum. Not the melody from before. Something new. Something slower and gentler, a lullaby her own mother had sung to her in childhood, in a language that existed before borders and diagnosis codes. From inside the fortress came the sound of the gyro. Daniel was playing along, learning the rhythm, making it his own. And in the kitchen, his parents stood listening to a conversation happening in a language they were only beginning to understand, between their son and a woman who had walked into their lives carrying nothing but patience and the belief that everyone deserves to be heard. The second week brought routine, and with routine came visibility. Rosa arrived each morning at 8, her canvas bag over her shoulder, and began the work she had been hired to do. But increasingly, the work expanded beyond cleaning. She would pause at the fortress doorway with small objects, a smooth stone from her pocket, a piece of ribbon, a bottle cap. She would set them just outside the cushion walls and walk away. Sometimes Daniel would reach out and take them. Sometimes he would ignore them. Rosa never seemed concerned either way. James found himself rearranging his schedule to be home during Rosa's hours. He told himself it was to monitor the situation, to ensure this unorthodox approach wasn't causing harm. But really, he wanted to witness the quiet magic that seemed to happen in her presence. He watched from the kitchen as she introduced Daniel to new sounds, clapping patterns, the crinkle of paper, the tap of a spoon against different surfaces. Each sound became a potential word, a potential bridge. Vanessa was less certain. She had begun keeping a notebook, documenting every interaction between Rosa and Daniel, writing down every new sound or gesture or moment of eye contact. She told herself it was for the specialists, evidence to present at the next consultation. But the notebook remained hidden in her nightstand, pages filling with observations she couldn't quite categorize as progress or concern. On the 9th day, Rosa brought a different instrument. A rain stick, long and cylindrical, filled with small beads that cascaded from one end to the other when tilted. She showed it to James and Vanessa first, demonstrating how the sound mimicked falling water. "Daniel loves patterns," she explained. "This instrument is all pattern. The beads fall in the same way every time, but the sound is never exactly identical. It is predictable and surprising at once." She carried it to the living room and sat on the floor near the fortress, closer than she had dared before. She tilted the rain stick slowly, letting the beads cascade with their gentle rushing sound. Then she waited. After a moment, one of the cushions shifted. Daniel's face appeared in the gap, eyes fixed not on Rosa but on the instrument. He watched the beads fall through the clear tube, his expression intense with concentration. Rosa tilted it again. Daniel's hand emerged from the fortress, reaching toward the sound. Rosa shifted position slightly, angling the rain stick so he could see it better without leaving his safe space. For 5 full minutes, they sat like that, Rosa creating the sound, Daniel watching and reaching, his fingers opening and closing in time with the cascading beats. Then Daniel crawled forward, just his arms and head emerging from the fortress. Rosa handed him the rain stick without a word. He took it carefully, holding it with both hands, tilting it tentatively. The beads rushed from one end to the other. His eyes widened. He tilted it again, faster this time. The sound changed, became more urgent. He tilted it slow. The sound softened, spread out, became almost meditative. For the next 20 minutes, Daniel experimented with the rain stick, discovering every variation of sound it could produce. Rosa sat beside him, not interfering, occasionally humming in harmony with the patterns he created. Vanessa watched from the stairs, her hand pressed against her chest, hardly breathing. When Daniel finally set down the instrument and retreated into his fortress, Rosa didn't try to follow or extend the moment. She simply picked up the rain stick, placed it on the coffee table where he could reach it if he chose, and returned to her work. But as she passed Vanessa on the stairs, she paused. "He is learning that the world outside his fortress can be interesting," Rosa said quietly. "This is important. But we must let him choose when to explore it. If we push, he will retreat further. If we wait, he will come out when he is ready." "How do you know?" Vanessa asked, and the question came out more desperate than she intended. "How do you know what he needs?" Rosa met her eyes. "Because I watch him," she said. "Not what the books say he should be. Not what the doctors say he will become. I watch him. Who he is right now, in this moment. And I listen to what he shows me." The words settled between them like a challenge. Vanessa wanted to argue, wanted to defend all the expertise they had sought, all the intervention plans they had implemented. But she couldn't. Because in 9 days, this woman with no credentials and no training had achieved what months of professional therapy had not. Connection. That afternoon, James received a call from his sister, Lauren, who lived in Manhattan and made a point of calling every few weeks to check in with the tone of someone performing charity. She had opinions about Daniel's condition, about the parenting choices James and Vanessa had made, about the specialists they should be seeing. She had never met Daniel in person, claiming her own children's busy schedules made visits impossible, but this hadn't prevented her from offering extensive advice. "How's Daniel doing?" Lauren asked after the obligatory pleasantries. "Are you still doing that intensive behavioral program?" "Actually," James said, hesitating, "we're trying something different. We hired someone who's been working with him in a less structured way." "What do you mean less structured?" Lauren's voice sharpened. "James, you can't just experiment with his treatment. Autism requires evidence-based intervention. You need to stick with what the research supports." "This is working," James said. "He's responding. He said his first word in 3 years." There was a pause. "What kind of specialist is this person?" "She's not a specialist," James admitted. "She's a housekeeper. But she has this way of connecting with him that nothing else has achieved." "A housekeeper?" Lauren's disbelief was palpable. "James, please tell me you're not letting some random person with no training work with your severely autistic son. This is exactly the kind of thing that ends up on the news. Desperate parents fall for unqualified practitioners who promise miracles." "She's not promising anything," James said, feeling his defenses rise. "She's just being present with him. And it's helping." "Or it's a coincidence," Lauren countered. "Or it's a temporary response that will fade. You need to be careful. You need to document everything. And honestly, you should probably run this by your legal team. If something goes wrong, if Daniel gets hurt or regresses, you could be held liable for allowing unqualified intervention." "Nothing is going wrong," James insisted, but doubt had already crept into his voice. "She's been wonderful with him." "I'm sure she's very nice," Lauren said, her tone softening into something more condescending. "But nice isn't enough. You have resources, James. Use them properly. Get Daniel the real help he needs, not folk remedies from the cleaning lady." The call ended shortly after, but its poison lingered. James sat in his office, staring at his phone, Lauren's words echoing. Unqualified. Liability. Folk remedies. He thought about the 7 specialists whose business cards still decorated the refrigerator, each with their credentials and certifications and peer-reviewed methodologies. And he thought about Rosa, with her worn canvas bag and her grandmother's instruments, sitting on the floor beside his son's fortress with infinite patience. That evening, he found Vanessa in the bedroom, her hidden notebook open on her lap. She was writing rapidly, her handwriting jagged with urgency. "My sister called today," James said, closing the door behind him. "She thinks we're being irresponsible. Letting Rosa work with Daniel without any formal training." Vanessa looked up, her expression unreadable. "What do you think?" James sat on the edge of the bed. "I think Daniel said a word for the first time in 3 years. I think he's engaging with the world in ways he hasn't before." I think something is working. But what if Lauren's right? Vanessa closed the notebook. What if this is just a temporary response? What if we're getting our hopes up for nothing? Worse, what if we're actually interfering with his development by allowing this unstructured approach? The specialists said structure was essential, James said slowly. They said consistency, routine, evidence-based intervention. Everything Rosa does contradicts that. Vanessa stood and walked to the window. I've been documenting everything, she said. Every interaction, every response. And James, the data doesn't lie. He's more engaged than he's been in years. But I keep asking myself why. Why does this work when everything else failed? Maybe because she's not trying to change him, James suggested. Maybe because she's meeting him where he is instead of where we want him to be. The words hung between them, uncomfortable in their implication. That perhaps all their efforts, all their expensive interventions, had been fundamentally misguided. That perhaps in trying so hard to help their son, they had been hurting him. Before either could respond, a sound interrupted them. Music. The rain stick, being played with deliberate slowness. They walked to Daniel's bedroom door, which stood slightly ajar. Inside, their son sat on his bed, tilting the instrument back and forth, creating a rhythm that sounded almost like a heartbeat. Slow and steady and alive. He had never played with anything in his bedroom before. His room was where he slept, nothing more. But now he sat in the dim light of his nightstand lamp, making music, creating patterns, existing in the world in a way that looked almost like peace. James felt his throat tighten. Vanessa reached for his hand and squeezed. Neither of them entered the room. They simply stood in the hallway, listening to their son speak in a language they were only beginning to understand. The next morning, Rosa arrived to find both James and Vanessa waiting for her in the kitchen. Their expressions were serious, and Rosa set down her bag slowly, reading the tension in the room. "We need to talk," Vanessa said. "Please, sit down." Rosa sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap, her face calm. James and Vanessa sat across from her, and for a moment no one spoke. "We've noticed how Daniel responds to you," James began carefully. "And we're grateful. But we've also been thinking about what's best for him long-term. About whether this approach is sustainable." "You want me to stop?" Rosa said. It wasn't a question. "No," Vanessa said quickly. "Not exactly. We just want to understand what you're doing. We want to be able to explain it to his doctors, to document it properly. Everything you do seems instinctive, but we need structure. We need to know that this is following some kind of methodology." Rosa was quiet for a long moment. Then she leaned forward slightly. "I understand your concern," she said. "You have been told by many important people that your son needs specific things. And now I come, someone with no letters after her name, no certificates on the wall, and I do something different. This frightens you because if it works, it means perhaps the important people were wrong. And if they were wrong, what does that say about the years you spent following their advice?" The observation landed with uncomfortable accuracy. Vanessa looked away. James cleared his throat. "It's not about being wrong," he said. "It's about being responsible. If something happened to Daniel while in your care, if he had a regression or an incident, we would be liable. We need documentation. We need some kind of framework that we can point to if anyone asks questions." "You mean if your sister asks questions," Rosa said gently. "Or if the specialists ask. Or if you ask yourselves in the quiet moments whether you are good parents." "That's not fair," Vanessa said, her voice strained. "No," Rosa agreed. "It is not fair. None of this is fair. Not for you, not for your son, not for any family living with these challenges. But fairness and truth are not always the same thing. The truth is that I cannot give you the documentation you want. I cannot tell you that what I do follows a methodology that someone famous created. I can only tell you that I pay attention. I watch your son. I learn what he needs by letting him teach me. This is not science. But it is not magic either. It is simply paying attention with love instead of fear. Her words created a silence that felt both heavy and clarifying. James and Vanessa looked at each other, then back at Rosa. "We're not trying to dismiss what you're doing," James said finally. "We're trying to protect him. And ourselves." "I know," Rosa said. "And this is wise. So I will make you an offer. I will write down what I do. Not as a method, but as observations. I will document each day what I tried and how Daniel responded. You can keep these notes. You can show them to whoever you need to show them. But I cannot promise that anyone will understand them because what I am doing cannot be reduced to steps and procedures. It is a conversation. And conversations cannot be scripted." Vanessa felt something loosen in her chest. "That would help," she said. "If we have documentation, if we can show that we're being thoughtful about this, that's something. But I must ask you for something in return," Rosa continued. "You must trust me. Not blind trust, but the trust that comes from watching. You have seen what happens when I am with Daniel. You have seen him emerge. You have seen him speak. If you trust what you have witnessed, then you must give me space to continue. If you cannot trust this, then it is better I leave now before your fear undoes what has begun to grow." The ultimatum was delivered without harshness, but its weight was undeniable. James and Vanessa had to choose. Continue down a path that defied everything the experts had told them, or retreat to the safety of conventional wisdom and risk losing the progress they had witnessed. "We trust what we've seen," James said, and he was surprised by how much he meant it. "We'll give you the space you need. But please, keep the notes. For our peace of mind if nothing else." Rosa nodded. "I will keep the notes," she said. "And I will continue to keep your son company while he learns to be in the world. This is all I can promise." She stood, picked up her canvas bag, and began the work she had come to do. But as she passed through the living room, she paused at the fortress. Daniel was inside. She could hear his breathing, steady and calm. She set down her bag and sat cross-legged on the floor. "Buenos dias, Daniel," she said softly. "Today I brought something new to show you." From her bag, she pulled a small wooden box, no bigger than her palm. She opened it, and inside were tiny bells, each a different size, each creating a different pitch when shaken. She selected one, the smallest, and rang it gently. The sound was clear and bright, a single pure note that lingered in the air. From inside the fortress came a rustling. Then Daniel's hand appeared, reaching toward the sound. Rosa placed the bell in his palm and closed his fingers around it gently. She released his hand and waited. Daniel shook the bell tentatively. The sound delighted him, she could tell by the way his breathing changed, became faster, more excited. He shook it again, harder this time. Then he began creating patterns, 3 quick shakes, a pause, 2 slower shakes, another pause. He was composing, building structure from sound. Rosa reached into the box and pulled out a second bell, slightly larger. She rang it, and its pitch was lower, fuller. She set it just inside the fortress entrance. Daniel picked it up and now held both bells. He shook them separately, learning their individual voices. Then he shook them together, discovering harmony. For the next hour, Rosa sat outside the fortress while Daniel experimented with the bells. She didn't interrupt or instruct. She simply witnessed. And in her notebook, the one she would keep for James and Vanessa, she wrote her first entry. Day 10. Introduced small bells, different pitches. Daniel explored each sound individually before combining them. Created rhythmic patterns with increasing complexity. Appeared focused and calm throughout. No distress observed. Engagement sustained for 63 minutes. He is learning that different sounds can live together. This is important. This is how we build toward language. Upstairs, Vanessa read the entry that evening after Rosa had left. She read it 3 times, looking for something to criticize, some justification for her anxiety. But she found only careful observation and genuine care. She placed the notebook in her nightstand drawer beside her own hidden documentation, and for the first time in years, she felt something that might have been hope or might have been terror. She couldn't quite tell the difference anymore. The following days established a new rhythm. Rosa would arrive, document her plans for the day in the notebook, work with Daniel using whatever instruments or objects she had brought, then write her observations before leaving. James and Vanessa read each entry religiously, watching their son through Rosa's eyes, learning to see what she saw. Daniel began leaving his fortress for longer periods. Not to interact with his parents, not yet, but to explore the instruments Rosa left around the living room. The rain stick became a particular favorite. He would carry it from room to room, tilting it slowly, creating his own private soundtrack. On the 14th day, Rosa brought fabric. Scarves in different textures, silk and cotton and rough burlap. She didn't explain their purpose. She simply laid them on the floor outside the fortress in a gradient from softest to roughest. Then she sat nearby and began folding them, one by one, narrating her actions. "This one feels like water," she said, running the silk through her fingers. "This one feels like clouds. This one feels like tree bark." Daniel emerged from his fortress and sat among the scarves. He touched each one tentatively, learning their textures, categorizing them in whatever system made sense to him. Then he picked up the silk scarf and draped it over his head. Rosa watched without moving. He sat like that for several minutes, the fabric creating a private space within the larger room. Then he pulled the scarf off and looked directly at Rosa. It was the first time he had made eye contact with her. The moment lasted only 2 seconds, but those 2 seconds changed everything. Rosa smiled, small and gentle, and nodded once. Daniel draped the scarf over his head again, but this time he giggled. A sound so unexpected that Rosa felt tears prick her eyes. He pulled the scarf off again and looked at her. Waiting. Rosa understood. It was a game. Peekaboo, simplified and adapted for a child who needed the world to be predictable but not boring. She covered her own face with her hands. 1, 2, 3. She dropped her hands. Daniel giggled again, louder this time. They played this game for 20 minutes, taking turns hiding and revealing, building trust through repetition and surprise. When Daniel finally tired of it, he gathered all the scarves and carried them into his fortress. Rosa let him. They were his now. He had claimed them. That evening's notebook entry was simple. Day 14. Introduced textured fabrics. Daniel explored each one, showed particular interest in silk. Initiated game of peekaboo with modifications. Made sustained eye contact twice. Laughed. This is the first time I have heard him express joy. It is the most beautiful sound. Vanessa read the entry while standing in the kitchen, and when she reached the last line, she sat down hard in the nearest chair. She had not heard her son laugh in so long that she had almost forgotten what it sounded like. The thought that he had laughed, had expressed joy, and she had not been there to witness it, created a complicated knot of emotions she couldn't untangle. James found her there an hour later, still holding the notebook. "What's wrong?" he asked. She showed him the entry. He read it, and his expression mirrored her own confusion of grief and gratitude. "He laughed," James said. "Our son laughed, and we weren't there." "But he laughed," Vanessa said. "That's what matters." "Is it?" James set down the notebook. "Or does it matter that a stranger heard it first? That we're so disconnected from our own child that we need someone else to document his milestones?" The question hung between them, barbed and painful. Before either could answer, they heard footsteps on the stairs. Daniel, in his pajamas, carrying the silk scarf and the rain stick. He walked past them without acknowledgement and went to the kitchen table. He set down the rain stick and draped the scarf over it. Then he tilted the whole arrangement, creating a muffled version of the cascading sound. James and Vanessa watched, hardly breathing. Daniel repeated the action several times, experimenting with how the fabric changed the sound. Then he picked up both objects and walked back upstairs, leaving his parents in stunned silence. "He's creating," James whispered. He's experimenting. That's problem solving. That's cognition. Vanessa nodded, unable to speak. They had been told so many times what their son couldn't do, what he would never achieve, that witnessing him think, create, explore felt like watching a miracle. But it also felt like an indictment. How much had they missed while focusing on what he lacked instead of what he possessed? The next morning, Rosa arrived to find a note taped to her canvas bag. It was from Vanessa, handwritten on expensive stationery. Thank you for seeing our son. We're trying to learn how to see him too. Rosa read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in the pocket of her dress. Then she picked up her bag and went to sit outside Daniel's fortress, ready to continue the work of witnessing, of making space, of believing that every person deserves to be understood in their own language. But outside the brownstone, things were shifting in ways none of them could see yet. Lauren had made calls, had spoken to colleagues who specialized in family law, had planted seeds of doubt in places where doubt grew easily. She convinced herself it was out of love, out of concern for her nephew. But really, it was out of discomfort with uncertainty, with the idea that perhaps expertise wasn't the only path to healing. And in the house, Daniel sat in his fortress with his collection of instruments and fabrics, building a world that made sense to him, one sound at a time, one texture at a time. He was learning that the world outside his walls could be interesting if approached on his terms. He was learning that some people listen differently. He was learning that his voice, however it emerged, would be heard. Rosa sat outside his fortress and began to hum a new melody, one her grandmother had taught her about birds learning to fly. And from inside the cushions, Daniel hummed back, adding his own notes, creating harmony from the space between fear and trust. 3 weeks into Rosa's presence in the Hartley household, Daniel did something nobody expected. He walked out of his fortress on a Tuesday morning, carried his collection of instruments to the kitchen table, and arranged them in a specific order. The gyro on the left, the rain stick in the center, the small bells on the right. Then he stood beside the table and looked at Rosa, who was washing vegetables at the sink. She dried her hands and walked over slowly. He pointed to the gyro. Rosa picked it up and played it, scraping the stick across its ridges in a steady rhythm. Daniel listened intently, then pointed to the rain stick. Rosa tilted it, letting the beads cascade. Daniel nodded, then pointed to the bells. Rosa rang each one in sequence, from lowest pitch to highest. When she finished, Daniel picked up the gyro himself and played it, mimicking her rhythm exactly. Then he set it down and pointed at Rosa again. She understood. He was teaching her a pattern, showing her how the instruments should be played together. This wasn't just engagement anymore. This was instruction. This was Daniel assuming the role of teacher. For the next 20 minutes, they worked through his composition. He would demonstrate what he wanted, and Rosa would follow, adding her own variations when he seemed open to them. The result was something between music and conversation, a call and response that existed in pure sound. James heard it from his office and came to the kitchen doorway. He stood there watching his son lead, direct, communicate with someone who understood that communication didn't require words. Vanessa came down the stairs and joined him. Neither parent spoke. They simply observed this collaboration, this partnership between their child and a woman who had entered their lives with nothing but willingness to listen. When the composition ended, Daniel gathered his instruments carefully and carried them back to his fortress. But before disappearing inside, he turned and looked at Rosa. His mouth opened, and he spoke a second word. Music. The word was clear, deliberate, chosen with purpose. Rosa smiled and placed her hand over her heart. Yes, she said softly. Music. That is what we made together. Daniel nodded once, satisfied, and retreated into his safe space. Rosa returned to the sink and continued washing vegetables as if miracles were simply part of the morning routine. James and Vanessa remained in the doorway, processing what they had witnessed. Their son had not only spoken, but he had used language to name something abstract, to categorize an experience, to share understanding. That afternoon, while Daniel napped in his fortress, James made a decision. He called Dr. Raymond Foster, the speech pathologist whose business card still hung on the refrigerator. He explained what had been happening, the instruments, the humming, the 2 words Daniel had spoken. He expected skepticism or dismissal. Instead, Dr. Foster asked to visit. He arrived the next day, a thin man in his 60s with kind eyes and a worn leather bag that looked like it had traveled through decades of speech therapy sessions. Rosa was there, working quietly in the dining room while Daniel played with his bells in the fortress. Dr. Foster introduced himself to Rosa with genuine respect, shaking her hand and thanking her for the work she was doing. "I've seen a lot of approaches over my career," he said to her. "And I've learned that the best interventions are the ones that meet the child where they are. From what James described, you've been doing exactly that. I'm not here to evaluate or criticize. I'm here to learn." Rosa appreciated his humility. She led him to the living room and explained her philosophy, simple as it was. "I do not try to change Daniel," she said. "I try to understand the language he already speaks. Music, rhythm, texture, these are his words. So I learn his vocabulary instead of forcing him to learn mine." Dr. Foster nodded, taking notes. "This aligns with a lot of current research on neurodiversity-affirming practices," he said. "The idea that autistic individuals don't need to be fixed, they need to be understood. But implementation is always the challenge. You seem to have an intuitive grasp of something that takes most professionals years to learn." He spent an hour observing Rosa work with Daniel, watching how she introduced a new instrument, a small drum with a soft mallet, and how Daniel explored it on his own terms. Dr. Foster made notes but didn't interrupt. When the session ended naturally, with Daniel returning to his fortress, Dr. Foster sat with James, Vanessa, and Rosa at the kitchen table. "What I'm seeing is remarkable," he said. "Daniel is engaged, curious, communicative in his own way. The 2 words he's spoken are significant not just because they're words, but because they represent abstract concepts. He's not just labeling objects. He's naming experiences and relationships. That's high-level cognitive work." "So what do we do now?" James asked. "Do we formalize this? Do we turn what Rosa's doing into some kind of structured program?" Dr. Foster shook his head. "I think that would be a mistake. What's working is precisely the lack of rigid structure. Daniel is learning that communication can happen on his terms, that his way of expressing himself is valid. If we try to systematize it, we risk turning it into just another therapy he has to endure. My recommendation is to continue exactly what you're doing, but with one addition." "What's that?" Vanessa leaned forward. "Documentation for language development," Dr. Foster said. "I'd like to work with Rosa to track Daniel's verbal and nonverbal communication. Not to create pressure or goals, but to have a professional record of his progress. This protects everyone and ensures that if Daniel ever needs additional support services, we have evidence of what works for him." Rosa nodded slowly. "I can do this. But I will not change how I am with him. He is not a project to be managed. He is a person to be known." Dr. Foster smiled. "That's exactly the right approach. And honestly, I think you could teach a lot of professionals a thing or two about autism intervention." Over the following week, Dr. Foster visited twice more, each time observing and taking notes, building what he called a communicative profile of Daniel. He documented not just words spoken but gestures made, rhythms created, eye contact initiated. He noted that Daniel had his own sophisticated system for expressing needs, preferences, and emotions, it just didn't conform to typical developmental milestones. He also did something else. He wrote a formal letter, on his professional letterhead, describing Rosa's work as a valid therapeutic approach grounded in relationship-based intervention and neurodiversity-affirming practice. He sent copies to James and Vanessa with a suggestion that they keep it on file in case anyone questioned their choices. "This might matter someday," he told them. "When families deviate from conventional treatment paths, even successfully, they sometimes face scrutiny. Consider this professional validation of what you're doing." James felt a weight lift that he hadn't known he was carrying. Having a respected specialist endorse Rosa's approach made him feel less like he was gambling with his son's future and more like he was honoring his son's present. Vanessa kept the letter in a folder with Rosa's notebooks, a growing archive of evidence that their unconventional choice was bearing fruit. But not everyone was convinced. Lauren called again, this time with more pointed questions. She had spoken to her own contacts in the autism treatment community, people who expressed concern about unproven methods and potential exploitation of vulnerable families. She didn't accuse James and Vanessa of anything directly, but her implications were clear. "I'm just worried," she said, her voice dripping with concern that felt more like judgment. "These people who prey on desperate parents, promising breakthroughs that never come. I don't want to see you get hurt. Or worse, I don't want to see Daniel suffer because you were too hopeful." "We have a speech pathologist documenting everything," James said, trying to keep his voice even. "Dr. Raymond Foster. You can look him up. He's one of the most respected professionals in the field, and he supports what we're doing." "But is he supervising this woman?" Lauren pressed. "Or is she working independently without oversight? Because if something goes wrong, James, if Daniel regresses or gets hurt, you could face serious consequences. I've been reading about cases where parents lost custody because they pursued unproven treatments." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. James felt anger rise in his throat. "Are you suggesting we're putting our son at risk? Are you actually implying we might lose custody of Daniel because we found someone who connects with him?" "I'm saying you need to be careful," Lauren replied. "I'm saying that love isn't always enough. You need professional guidance. You need to follow established protocols. Otherwise, you're opening yourself up to allegations of neglect or worse." The call ended badly, with James hanging up before he said something he couldn't take back. But the seed of fear had been planted. That evening, he and Vanessa lay in bed, both staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. "What if she's right?" Vanessa whispered. "What if we're so desperate for progress that we're ignoring real risks?" "What risks?" James asked. "Daniel is thriving. He's speaking. He's engaging. He's happy. What risk is there in that?" "The risk that we're wrong," Vanessa said. "The risk that this is temporary. The risk that we've put all our faith in someone who might not be able to deliver long-term results. And if it all falls apart, if Daniel regresses, we'll have nothing to fall back on because we abandoned all the traditional therapies." James turned to look at her. "Do you want to stop? Do you want to tell Rosa to leave and go back to the behavioral programs and the specialists who made no progress in 2 years?" Vanessa closed her eyes. "No," she admitted. "I don't want to stop. But I'm terrified that wanting something to work isn't the same as it actually working." They didn't resolve anything that night. They simply lay in the dark, caught between hope and fear, between what they had witnessed and what they had been taught to believe. Downstairs, in his fortress, Daniel slept peacefully, surrounded by instruments and fabrics, dreaming in patterns only he could see. The next morning, Rosa arrived to find James and Vanessa waiting for her again. Her expression remained calm, but she could sense the shift in energy. They asked her to sit, and this time the conversation was different. "We need to know your plan," James said. "Long term. What happens when Daniel outgrows these instruments? What happens when he needs to function in the real world, in school, in society? How does what you're doing prepare him for that?" Rosa folded her hands in her lap. "I do not have a plan for Daniel," she said. "Because I cannot make a plan for someone else's life. I can only walk beside him while he discovers his own path. What I am teaching him is that he has value as he is, that his way of being in the world is not wrong. The rest will come." "But it has to come," Vanessa said, her voice strained. "He has to learn to live in a world that won't accommodate him the way we do. He needs skills, coping mechanisms, strategies for managing in environments that aren't tailored to his needs." "Yes," Rosa agreed. "And he will learn those things when he is ready. But first, he must learn that he is worthy of accommodation. He must learn that his differences are not defects. If we teach him to hate himself before we teach him to navigate the world, we have failed him entirely." The words hung in the air, sharp and true. James and Vanessa had spent years trying to make Daniel fit into a world that seemed designed to reject him. Rosa was suggesting something radical, that perhaps the world needed to bend toward Daniel as much as Daniel needed to bend toward the world. Before anyone could respond, Daniel emerged from his fortress. He walked directly to Rosa and held out his hand. In his palm were 3 bells, carefully selected. He placed them in her hand, then pointed to the kitchen. Rosa stood and followed him. James and Vanessa trailed behind, curious and cautious. Daniel led Rosa to the kitchen table and pointed at a chair. She sat. He climbed onto the chair beside her and pulled the notebook, Rosa's observation journal, toward him. He opened it to a blank page. Then he picked up a pen and drew a shape. A circle with lines radiating outward, like a sun. He pointed at the drawing, then at himself. Rosa understood immediately. "Daniel," she said, touching the drawing gently. He nodded, then drew another shape. A larger circle around the first, with smaller circles scattered around its edge. He pointed at Rosa, then at James, then at Vanessa. Then he touched one of the smaller circles. He was drawing his world, his understanding of how people related to him. He was at the center, the sun. They were the orbit around him. "Family," Rosa said softly, and Daniel nodded again. Then he drew one more thing. A line connecting his son to Rosa's circle. Not the same as the lines to his parents, but present nonetheless. He tapped the line, then looked at Rosa with an expression that asked if she understood. "I am part of your world," Rosa said, her voice thick with emotion. "You are telling me I belong here." Daniel picked up one of the bells and rang it once. Yes. The sound meant yes. They all understood. James sat down hard in the nearest chair. Vanessa covered her mouth with both hands. Their son had just communicated something profound, something that went beyond simple needs or preferences. He had expressed a complex understanding of relationships, of belonging, of connection. And he had done it without speaking a single word. Rosa carefully closed the notebook and placed it in front of James. "Show this to anyone who questions what we are doing," she said. "Show them that Daniel is not silent. He is speaking every day. We are simply learning his language." That afternoon, James scanned Daniel's drawing and emailed it to Dr. Foster with a brief explanation. The response came within an hour. "This is extraordinary symbolic communication. This child has a sophisticated understanding of his social world. I would love to use this as a teaching example with your permission. What you're witnessing is not a miracle. It's what happens when we stop trying to fix people and start trying to understand them." James printed the email and added it to their growing folder of documentation. Vanessa stood in the hallway, watching Daniel play with his instruments in the fortress, and felt something shift inside her. For 3 years, she had mourned the child she thought she had lost. But maybe she hadn't lost him at all. Maybe she had simply been looking for the wrong version of him. That evening, Rosa stayed late to help prepare dinner, something she rarely did but offered because she could sense the family needed her presence. As she chopped vegetables, Daniel came into the kitchen and stood beside her. He didn't speak or gesture. He simply stood there, shoulder almost touching her arm, being near her. Rosa continued her work, occasionally humming softly. After several minutes, Daniel reached over and touched one of the vegetables. A carrot. He picked it up and examined it, then tapped it against the counter. The sound interested him. He tapped it again, creating a rhythm. Rosa picked up a second carrot and joined him, tapping a complementary pattern. Soon they were making music with vegetables, creating a percussion ensemble from produce. Vanessa walked in to find them both completely absorbed in this impromptu performance, and instead of worrying about the mess or the disruption, she picked up a spoon and added her own beat. Daniel looked at his mother, really looked at her, for the first time in what felt like forever. He held out a carrot to her, inviting her to play his way. Vanessa took it with shaking hands and followed his lead, matching his rhythm, speaking his language. For 5 minutes, the three of them made music together, connected through sound rather than words. When James came home from a late meeting, he found his family in the kitchen, covered in carrot shavings, laughing. Daniel was laughing, that beautiful sound Rosa had documented in her notebook, and Vanessa was laughing too, tears streaming down her face. Rosa stood at the sink washing dishes, humming the melody they had created, and the whole scene looked like something James had stopped believing was possible. Normal. It looked normal. Not perfect, not fixed, but real and alive and connected. That night, after Rosa had gone home and Daniel was asleep in his fortress, James and Vanessa sat together in the living room. They didn't talk about Lauren or the specialists or their fears about the future. They simply sat in the space where their son had chosen to make music with vegetables, and they felt something that had been absent for years. Peace. Not the peace of resolution or certainty, but the peace of acceptance. The peace of knowing that their son was exactly who he needed to be, and that their job was not to change him but to walk beside him while he became more fully himself. In her small apartment across town, Rosa sat at her own kitchen table and wrote in a personal journal she kept separate from the official documentation. Today Daniel showed me how he sees his world. He put himself at the center like the sun. This is correct. He is the sun. We are lucky to orbit him. I hope his parents understand this before time teaches them the hard way. Every child is the sun of their own world. Our job is not to dim them so they fit our sky. Our job is to learn to see by their light. She closed the journal and looked at a photograph on her wall. Her own 3 children, grown now, smiling at a family gathering. She thought about her youngest grandson, the one who didn't speak until he was 5, who now talked endlessly about dinosaurs in space. She thought about all the ways people tried to force children into shapes that didn't fit them, and she felt grateful that she had learned, finally, to wait and watch and listen. The next morning would bring new challenges, new doubts, new questions from people who didn't understand. But tonight, in a Brooklyn brownstone and a small apartment, 2 families rested in the knowledge that connection was possible, that love could cross the borders of difference, and that sometimes the most profound communication happened in the space between words. 6 months had passed since Rosa first walked through the door of the Hartley brownstone, and the house had transformed in ways that couldn't be measured by specialists or documented in notebooks. The fortress still stood in the living room, but it had evolved. Now it was decorated with strings of bells, fabric draped across its entrance, and a small sign Daniel had made himself, a piece of cardboard with careful letters spelling out Daniel's place. He still retreated there when the world became too loud or too bright, but he also emerged more frequently, venturing into other rooms, exploring the house as if discovering it for the first time. The instruments Rosa had introduced were scattered throughout the space, a gyro on the bookshelf, the rain stick beside the sofa, bells on the windowsill. The house itself had become an instrument, each room offering different sounds and textures for Daniel to explore. Rosa's role had shifted as well. She was no longer just the housekeeper who cleaned around a silent child. She had become something the family didn't have words for, not quite a therapist, not quite a nanny, something more fundamental. A bridge. A translator. A witness to Daniel's unfolding. James had stopped apologizing for the unconventional arrangement. When colleagues asked about Daniel's progress, he spoke plainly about Rosa's approach, about music and patience in meeting his son in his own language. Some people nodded politely and changed the subject. Others leaned in with genuine curiosity, asking questions, wanting to understand. James learned to distinguish between the 2 types quickly. Vanessa had begun joining Rosa's sessions with Daniel, not to supervise or document, but to learn. She sat on the floor beside the fortress and followed Rosa's lead, introducing new textures, new sounds, new patterns. Daniel seemed to appreciate his mother's presence in a way he hadn't before, now that she was speaking his language instead of trying to teach him hers. On a cold November morning, something remarkable happened. Daniel woke early and instead of building patterns with his blocks or playing his instruments, he walked to his parents' bedroom and stood beside the bed. James woke first, startled to find his son standing there in the dim light of dawn. "Daniel?" James sat up slowly, careful not to startle him. Are you okay? Daniel held out his hand. And it was a small bell, the first one Rosa had given him months ago. He placed it in James's palm and closed his father's fingers around it. Then he turned and walked out of the room. James looked at Vanessa, who was now awake and watching with wide eyes. "What does that mean?" she whispered. "I think it means follow him," James said. They got out of bed and trailed Daniel down the hallway. He led them to the living room, where he had arranged all of his instruments in a large circle on the floor. The gyro, the rain stick, all the bells, the drum, the scarves, even the vegetables from their kitchen music session, now dried and preserved. Everything that had been part of his journey toward communication was laid out with careful intention. Daniel sat in the center of the circle and gestured for his parents to sit on opposite sides. They did, moving slowly, afraid to disrupt whatever was happening. Daniel picked up the gyro and played it, the same rhythm Rosa had taught him on that first day. Then he set it down and pointed at James. James picked up the instrument and tried to replicate the rhythm. It wasn't perfect, but it was close enough. Daniel nodded, then picked up the rain stick and tilted it. The beads cascaded with their familiar rushing sound. He pointed at Vanessa. She took the rain stick with trembling hands and tilted it, watching the beads fall, creating the sound that had become so familiar in their home. Daniel nodded again, then picked up 3 bells and played them in sequence. He looked at both parents, then played the sequence again, slower this time. An invitation. James and Vanessa understood. Together, they picked up bells and tried to match his pattern. It took several attempts, but eventually they found the rhythm. Daniel smiled, and that smile was worth more than every specialist's report, every intervention plan, every expensive therapy session they had ever purchased. For 20 minutes, the 3 of them made music together. Daniel would introduce a pattern, and his parents would follow, learning to hear the world the way he heard it, learning to speak the language he had been using all along. When the session ended, Daniel gathered his instruments carefully and returned them to their places around the room. Then he walked to his parents and did something he had never done before. He hugged them. Not the limp, obligatory embrace therapists had tried to teach him, but a real hug, arms wrapped tight, head pressed against their shoulders, choosing closeness on his own terms. Vanessa began to cry, quiet tears that fell without sound. James held his family together, feeling the weight and warmth of his son's body against his own, feeling connection that required no words at all. When Daniel pulled away, he looked at his mother and spoke his 4th word. "Mama." Then he looked at his father and spoke his 5th. "Dada." The words were clear and certain, chosen with the same deliberation he applied to everything else. He wasn't labeling them because he had been taught to. He was naming them because he wanted to, because these sounds now meant something to him, because he was ready to use their language alongside his own. James couldn't speak. He simply nodded, holding his son's gaze for a long moment before Daniel turned and walked back to his fortress, satisfied with what he had accomplished. Vanessa leaned against James, and they held each other in the quiet of the living room, in the space their son had just transformed into something sacred. When Rosa arrived an hour later, they told her what had happened. She listened with her characteristic calm, nodding as if she had known this moment would come, as if she had simply been waiting for Daniel to choose his timing. "This is how it happens," she said. "Not when we push, but when we make space. He has been ready for a long time. He was just waiting until you were ready too." The observation stung a little, but James and Vanessa knew it was true. They had spent so long trying to force their son into readiness for a world that didn't accommodate him, they hadn't considered that maybe they needed to become ready for him, ready to meet him where he lived, ready to learn his language instead of demanding he learn theirs. That afternoon, Dr. Foster made his regular visit to observe and document. When James told him about the morning session, about the circle of instruments and the hug and the words, Dr. Foster set down his pen and removed his glasses. "Do you understand what you've just described?" he asked. "You've described a child initiating joint attention, organizing a social activity, demonstrating emotional regulation, and using verbal communication for relational purposes. Those are milestones that many specialists said Daniel would never reach. And he didn't reach them through intensive behavioral modification or structured therapy. He reached them because you gave him permission to be himself while he learned to be part of your world. So what does this mean for his future? Vanessa asked. Does this mean he's going to be okay? Dr. Foster smiled gently. Define okay. Will he be exactly like neurotypical children? No. Will he face challenges? Absolutely. Will he need support and understanding throughout his life? Most likely. But will he be able to connect with people, to express himself, to live a meaningful life on his own terms? Based on what I've seen, yes. Daniel is going to be exactly who Daniel is meant to be. Your job is to keep making space for that person to emerge. Over the following weeks, Daniel's vocabulary grew slowly but steadily. He learned words for things that mattered to him: music, soft, mama, dada, Rosa, bells, blue, quiet. He didn't speak in sentences, didn't engage in typical conversation, but he used language as a tool alongside his other forms of communication. Sometimes he spoke. Sometimes he played instruments. Sometimes he drew pictures. Sometimes he simply gestured or made eye contact. All of it was communication. All of it was valid. The family established new rituals. Every morning, Daniel would choose an instrument and play it for his parents before breakfast. Every afternoon, Rosa would introduce something new: a texture, a sound, a pattern. Every evening, James and Vanessa would sit with Daniel in his fortress and let him teach them something: how to arrange blocks, how to fold fabric, how to listen to the different sounds the house made when it settled. Lauren called less frequently. When she did, her tone had shifted from judgment to something approaching curiosity. She had heard through family channels about Daniel's progress, about the words he was speaking, about the connections he was making. She asked if she could visit, her voice tentative, almost apologetic. James hesitated, then agreed. When she arrived on a Saturday afternoon, Daniel was in his fortress, and Rosa was in the kitchen preparing lunch. Lauren stood in the foyer holding a gift bag, looking uncertain and small in a way James had never seen her. "Thank you for letting me come," she said. "I know I haven't been supportive. I was wrong about a lot of things." James didn't make it easy for her. "You called me irresponsible. You suggested we might lose custody. You tried to undermine what we were doing." "I was scared," Lauren said quietly. "Scared that you were being taken advantage of. Scared that Daniel would be hurt. But mostly scared that if your unconventional approach worked, it would mean all my certainties about how things should be done were wrong. And I wasn't ready to question those certainties." Rosa emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her embroidered towel. She studied Lauren for a moment, then extended her hand. "I am Rosa," she said. "You must be the sister who makes phone calls." Lauren flushed but shook her hand. "Yes. I'm sorry for that. I should have trusted my brother's judgment." "You should have trusted Daniel's voice," Rosa corrected gently. "Even when it did not sound like you expected. But you are here now. That is what matters." She led Lauren to the living room. Daniel was visible through the gap in his fortress, arranging bells by size. Rosa knelt beside the entrance and spoke softly. "Daniel, there is someone here who would like to meet you. Your Aunt Lauren. You do not have to come out if you do not want to. But she brought you a gift." Daniel's hands paused in their work. After a moment, he crawled to the entrance and peered out. He looked at Lauren with his intense, evaluating gaze. She knelt down slowly, making herself smaller, less threatening. "Hi Daniel," she said. "I brought you something. I hope you like it." She reached into the gift bag and pulled out a small wooden xylophone, brightly colored, with a mallet attached by a string. It was the kind of toy you could find in any children's store, nothing exotic or specially chosen. But when Daniel saw it, his eyes widened. He crawled out of the fortress and took the xylophone carefully. He set it on the floor and tapped each bar with the mallet, learning its scale, discovering its voice. Then he looked up at Lauren and spoke. "Thank you." 2 words, clearly articulated, directed at someone he had just met. Lauren's face crumpled. She covered her mouth with both hands and began to cry. Daniel watched her with curiosity but not alarm. He seemed to understand that her tears were not dangerous, just another form of communication. Rosa touched Lauren's shoulder gently. "He knows you brought him a gift," she said. "He knows you are trying. This is enough for today." Lauren nodded, unable to speak. Daniel took his xylophone and retreated into his fortress, where he spent the next hour learning its sounds, adding its voice to his collection. When Lauren left that afternoon, she hugged James tightly and whispered that she was sorry, that she had been so focused on being right that she had forgotten to be kind. As winter deepened, the Hartley household found its rhythm. Daniel started attending a small, specialized school 3 mornings a week, a program recommended by Dr. Foster that focused on neurodiversity-affirming education. The teachers there understood that Daniel's way of learning was different but not deficient, that his need for patterns and predictability wasn't a problem to be solved but a framework to be respected. He came home from school with drawings and stories told in his own visual language, pictures that showed how he understood the world. Rosa would sit with him and ask him to teach her what each image meant, and slowly, with words and gestures and sounds, he would explain. His communication was becoming richer, more layered, more confident. One evening in December, as snow fell softly outside and the house glowed with warm light, Daniel emerged from his fortress carrying a piece of paper. He walked to where Rosa sat reading in the armchair and placed the paper in her lap. It was a drawing, more complex than any he had done before. In the center was a sun, like the one he had drawn months ago to represent himself. But now there were other suns around it, smaller but equally bright. One was labeled Mama. One was labeled Dada. One was labeled Rosa. Each sun had its own light, its own space, but they were all connected by gentle lines that suggested relationship without hierarchy. At the bottom of the page, in careful letters, Daniel had written a sentence. His first full sentence, completed independently. "We are all sons." Rosa read it 3 times, her vision blurring. She looked at Daniel, who was watching her face carefully, waiting to see if she understood. She pulled him into her lap, something she had never done before, waiting always for him to initiate contact. But now felt like the right moment to show him that understanding could flow in both directions. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We are all sons. You are right. You are so very right." Daniel leaned against her, comfortable and still, and together they sat in the warm glow of the lamp while snow fell outside and the house held them in its quiet embrace. James and Vanessa watched from the doorway, bearing witness to this moment of perfect understanding between their son and the woman who had taught him that his light was not too bright, just different. That night, after Daniel was asleep and Rosa had gone home, James and Vanessa sat in the living room with the drawing between them. They studied it for a long time, this map of their son's understanding of love and connection. "He sees us as equals," Vanessa said softly. "Not as authorities or caretakers. As fellow sons." James nodded. "And maybe that's what we needed to learn. That parenting isn't about dimming our children's light so they fit our sky. It's about learning to see by their light." The words echoed what Rosa had written in her private journal months ago, the truth that Daniel had been teaching them all along. That every person carries their own light. That difference is not deficiency. That the most profound act of love is not to change someone but to witness them as they are. In her apartment, Rosa sat at her kitchen table and wrote her final entry in the official observation notebook, the one she would give to James and Vanessa tomorrow as her documentation of their journey together. Today Daniel drew a picture showing that he understands we are all equal in our importance, all necessary in our difference. He has learned to use words, yes. But more importantly, he has learned that he was always speaking, and we were the ones who needed to learn his language. My work here is not finished, because this kind of work is never finished. But it has changed. I am no longer teaching Daniel how to communicate. I am learning from him how to listen. This is the greatest gift any person can give another. The gift of being heard. She closed the notebook and looked at the photograph on her wall, her children and grandchildren gathered together, each one unique, each one precious. She thought about her youngest grandson, the one who hadn't spoken until he was 5, who now wrote poetry about the stars. She thought about Daniel, who was learning that his voice mattered in all its forms. And she felt grateful for the opportunity to witness these unfoldings, these slow and certain emergences of people becoming who they were always meant to be. The next morning, Rosa arrived at the Hartley brownstone for the last time as their housekeeper. She was transitioning to a different role, one that Dr. Foster had helped create, as a consultant for the school Daniel attended, helping teachers understand how to create spaces where neurodivergent children could thrive. She would still see Daniel 3 times a week, but in a different context, with a different purpose. When she told James and Vanessa about the change, they felt panic rise briefly. But Daniel, sitting nearby with his xylophone, looked up and spoke with calm certainty. Rosa stays. And they understood. Rosa would always stay, not in the same form, but in the language she had taught them, in the patience she had modeled, in the belief she had given them that their son was exactly who he needed to be. She handed them the notebook with its final entry, and Vanessa read it aloud while James listened and Daniel played soft notes on his xylophone. When she finished, there was silence, the kind that holds understanding rather than emptiness. "Thank you," James said finally. "For seeing our son. For teaching us to see him too." Rosa smiled, touching the embroidered towel she had carried since her first day. "You would have found your way eventually," she said. "I just helped you walk the path a little faster. Daniel was always the teacher. I just translated." She knelt beside Daniel and spoke to him directly. "I will see you on Monday," she said. "At school. We will make music there too." Daniel looked at her, then at his parents, then back at Rosa. He set down his xylophone and wrapped his arms around her neck in a hug that said everything words couldn't. When he pulled away, he picked up 3 bells and handed one to Rosa, one to his mother, one to his father. Then he rang his own bell, clear and bright. They rang theirs in response, and for a moment, the 4 of them stood in the living room making a chorus of sound that was both music and conversation, both structure and freedom, both separate notes in perfect harmony. Outside, snow continued to fall, soft and steady, covering Brooklyn in quiet white. Inside the brownstone, a family had learned that love speaks many languages, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stop trying to translate and simply listen. Daniel's fortress still stood in the corner, but it was no longer a hiding place. It was a home base, a place to retreat and recharge before venturing back into a world that was learning, slowly, to make space for all kinds of light. And in that space, a boy who specialists said might never speak had found his voice, not by becoming someone different, but by teaching the people around him to hear the person he had been all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.